Hello and welcome to The Scoop, our weekly Henry Jackson Society discussion on the threats facing the Western world, being broadcast to you live from Millbank Tower in the heart of Westminster. While others are keen to play down the threats facing our democracy, values and societies, here we promise to give you the truth, straight and unvarnished. Just as importantly, we pledge to involve you, our audience, too. This show is not about us talking and you listening. Instead, if you've got something to say, you can click the link in the video description just under where you are watching. You'll be redirected to our online studio and might get to ask one live. I can't promise we'll agree with you if you call, but I can tell you we'll certainly engage with your point of view. Today, we are looking once again at Ukraine. Given the latest developments in the war, with negotiations taking place today, I'll be asking, can we trust Russia with its objectives in this conflict? And where do we go from here in the West as well? And joining me to discuss that is Daniel Korski, a famous foreign policy guru, formerly of Number 10, now assisting in the tech sphere in his new role as CEO of Publix. Dan, welcome to the show. Delighted to have you with us. I mean, it's a fascinating time today, given the negotiations that have been going on. Now, all of us have been horrified, obviously, at what sort of played out in the last few weeks and period. Where do you think we're heading today? Are these realistic negotiations? Is there something there, or is this just puff and huff?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your program. You know, we don't like to think that things evolve in a linear fashion. You know, there's a run-up to war, there's a negotiation, and there's a peace. And we all get terribly disappointed when things are out of sequence. But the reality is, if you look at the way that wars have been conducted over the last couple of years, the way in which Russia in particular has engaged, but elsewhere too, the reality is it's rarely linear like that, you know. And so I think we can expect negotiations to take place, war to resume, negotiations to take place, and at some point, hopefully, we'll get to some kind of a point where the parties have either exhausted themselves or agreed enough that they can move to some kind of ceasefire. We have seen in the past that Russia prefers to use negotiations to string things along. I think there's every reason to believe that they're not serious and every reason to continue negotiating nonetheless. And that's clearly what President Zelensky is choosing to do.
Which he's doing, of course, at the moment. But it's interesting. There's some interesting things you said there. We can dig into them. But let's start from the perspective of what is actually happening in those negotiations. It looks like Ukraine is conceding quite a bit already, or at least in theory, with the neutrality case, for example. Maybe we should, look at that and say, is that a real concession, or is that something that is still being debated?
So the first thing to say is, it seems to me that there are several negotiations going on, of which this is simply the latest, and there have been an ongoing process of sending emissaries to, particularly President Putin. Obviously, the French president has carried messages, but underneath the surface, so have others. So I think this is just sort of not the negotiation, but the latest in a series of quasi-negotiations. But it's clear that President Zelensky has been willing to test what will be required to reach some kind of peace. He recently, in an interview to Russian journalists, said he'd be willing to contemplate some form of neutrality. Now he's talking about whether or not Crimea and the status of Crimea can be put in some kind of sovereignty abeyance. Further,
almost like an escrow account.
Some escrow account, and that is indeed also what President Erdogan's foreign policy advisor has talked about. And we do, of course, have examples of that. Sevastopol was, of course, one example. The area of Berchko in northern Bosnia, which was sort of co-owned by the formerly warring factions, with a promise of some kind of referendum later on. So there is a there's a precedent, a historical precedent for that kind of arrangement. But of course, again, that assumes that President Putin is happy with some kind of compromise. Of course, what we've heard until now has been various different adjustments of his maximalist aims. No longer a need to denazify Ukraine, but simply to ensure that the Nazis in Ukraine behave in a certain way deemed respectable by Russia.
Neutral way, maybe. A demilitarized neutral way.
A demilitarized Nazi way. So we don't know. We also know that when other leaders have spoken to President Putin, he has shown no willingness to concede. In fact, quite the opposite, a continued bloodthirst. And the latest leaks around Roman Abramovich's overtures to President Putin have it that President Putin rejected any suggestion of a compromise, and instead apparently used the phrase, "We will crush them," quote unquote.
Oh, how wonderful! Was this before or after Abramovich was poisoned?
If indeed he was poisoned, we don't yet.
It's a bit of a mysterious story, right? And we hear these reports suddenly in the press. There's been an apparent poisoning. Him, some Ukrainians, obviously in the previous rounds. Then, of course, the Americans saying environmental factors were responsible for his apparently going blind or something. It seems a little unusual. What's going on there?
Well, we don't really know what's going on, but when you don't know what's going on, it's good to follow the Latin phrase "qui bono," who benefits.
Sure.
And in many ways, I don't want to be too cynical, but Roman Abramovich certainly benefits from sharing that story. He's someone who has been put in an uncomfortable spotlight, who's had lots of his assets seized and has argued, and indeed so has the Ukrainian government argued on his behalf, that he should have been spared because he'd be helpful as a go-between, but he hasn't been spared by certainly UK sanctions, so he certainly stands to benefit. The Ukrainians themselves seem to be reluctant to admit anything untoward has happened, so it's really quite difficult. Now, one thing that is particularly worrying from the story is if it is indeed true that it is either something done at President Putin's behest or something that's been done by others in the Russian regime following what they thought were President Putin's orders, or indeed acting by themselves, indeed potentially even against what they
thought. Which is extraordinary.
That is much more worrying. Hard to know whether at this stage of the war, different factions in Russia really have the capability to do something like that. Can't rule it out, but it's hard to draw any kind of definitive conclusion, except to say there's a lot of contentiousness around the negotiations. Otherwise, I think these stories wouldn't be coming to light.
Yes, exactly. I think that's quite obvious from the tittle-tattle that's appearing. But it is curious that Abramovich is so involved in this. I mean, he had propped up again today in Istanbul, a picture of him at the negotiations. Why him out of all of the so-called oligarchs? Why is he there?
I couldn't speculate to which oligarch has the kind of relationships required both to President Putin and President Zelensky. But it's clear that Abramovich is one of those, and it's clear that he has been from the beginning keen to get involved and to show that he can make a difference. He has, at the same time, of course, been quick to plead that he is in no way associated with President Putin. So there's a little bit of a tension. If you, on the one hand, can be a confidant and a go-between, it assumes that you have some kind of personal relationship, which, on the other hand, he's desperate to deny. So it's a bit unclear. But at the same time, it's also clear that the Ukrainian government has welcomed his engagement.
Yes,
indeed, we've seen reports that they pleaded with Western governments not to sanction Abramovich in order to allow him to play this role. That's a position the U.S. government seems to have accepted. It's not a position the British government seems to have accepted. Indeed, the British government seems to have wanted to put the onus on Abramovich to show that he can produce a valuable contribution, and then perhaps his sanctions will be lifted. But
it's before or after he sells Chelsea.
Well, indeed, and there are lots of questions around that too. But
yes.
it's certainly the case that of those we've heard of, he has been more actively
involved in that way. A reminder for you at home that you can, of course, join in the conversation. Just click the link underneath this video and you can ask Daniel and I a question a bit later. Daniel, what's interesting here as well is that Turkey is so heavily involved. Now, President Erdogan is a bit of a prickly character himself. He and Putin have had their own disagreements in the past, and we shouldn't forget the Turks did shoot down a Russian jet at some point, given the sort of argy-bargy over Syria. He suddenly emerged as quite a pivotal player here. Is Turkey sort of seeing this as a moment, shall we say, for its diplomacy?
I think it's a great question, and you're absolutely right to say that Erdogan and Putin haven't always had the best of relations. Indeed, President Erdogan has made it clear recently that if only NATO had followed, if you will, the Turkish strategy of facing off Russia with strength, NATO wouldn't have found itself in the same situation as it does today. So not only did he have, as you say, an argy-bargy with Russia, but he's also sort of looked back at that and talked about it as if it was a sort of well thought out foreign policy move. I mean, Turkey has in many ways sought under President Erdogan to sort of be the cat that walked in the middle, to be part of NATO, but at the same time, continue to trade successfully with Russia, including defense trade. So in a way, it's a kind of continuation of Erdogan's equidistancing policy, trying to position Turkey as, if not non-aligned, then with enough leeway to act in its own, what it perceives its own.
Yes, in that sort of way.
Now,
but it's working, or?
Well, there are two questions. One is it working for Turkey? And the second question is it working for Ukraine? Those are two separate questions. Is it working for Turkey? For sure. It is positioning, President Erdogan at a time when his economy has been very hard hit, when changes in the Middle East haven't necessarily gone in the direction we would have wanted, at a moment when relations, particularly with the EU, but also with NATO, have been prickly. So for sure, President Erdogan has come into this crisis, if not on the back foot, then in a far less favorable position than he has been for a long time, potentially even facing new electoral pressures in a way he hasn't for a while. So yes, I do think that it works to position Turkey. The extent to which it'll actually make a difference to the crisis, I think that's a separate question. And I think the Turks can facilitate and support an outcome, and in many ways, by sending the Bayraktar drones to Ukraine, have already had an extraordinary impact on the battlefield, but we don't yet know how it'll pan out.
How that sort of, of course, and that's the question will have to be ultimately Ukraine and Russia coming to a meeting of minds, or whatever they come to resolve that. But it is interesting to see Erdogan back in the centre of international. And
I think we should also underline the economic dimension of this. The Erdogan regime has been very clear that they continue to welcome Russian investment. Lots of Russians have flown to Turkey, complementing the already large community of Russians living in Turkey or visiting Turkey regularly. The latest being Anatoly Chubais, who was reportedly pictured in Istanbul airport. And there have even been, statements by various Turkish officials that even sanctioned oligarchs could find a welcoming home in Turkey. I think they'll quickly find that any money deposited in Turkish banks would lead to those banks being sanctioned. But nonetheless, there's an economic dimension to this at a time when Turkish inflation is rampant and Erdogan's economic policies in tatters.
Yes, it's been a bit of a disaster for some time. Now, the negotiations were sort of preceded or joined by the Russians saying that they were going to be, ceasing activity or cutting back around Chernihiv and Kiev. This is presumably because they've recognised they can't bite everything off at one go, or is it actually they have scaled down their ambitions? There's two schools of thought, aren't there? There's one which is, all right, we're not winning here, we're not winning the south, we are winning in the east, let's focus on the east. The second is, actually, we're going to do this one step at a time. Let's see how far we get in the east. If we get that, then we'll move to the other bits.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it begs a number of follow-on questions, which is, who are they? As in, are we looking at a unified Russian chain of command with clear ideas at the top, implemented all the way down to the tactical level? And I think the answer probably is no.
Given what we've seen over the past
given what we've seen, does that mean that people at the top don't quite know what's going on? Some they will know, some they won't. So I think we have to give some leeway to, they may be trying to execute a strategy while that is not necessarily being kind of implemented on the ground in the way that they envisage. But I think it is true to say that they have realized that they cannot, they don't have the mass to take Kiev. They don't have the logistical support. They're potentially running out of even the ammunition they've been throwing at civilian buildings so far. And so it looks like they're concentrating on the east, as you say, having certainly put out a rationale that this was the plan all along. Of course, then it's hard to understand why they continue to bomb Kiev and why they continue to bomb even as far as Lviv, although that may be a sign of them indicating, look, just because we're focusing on east, don't you think that you're going to have an easy time there in Kiev? It would certainly be a logical strategy, something that most military analysts suggested they should have been implementing, several weeks ago, if not from the start of the crisis. It certainly is a strategy that fits more neatly with the narrative that President Putin has laid out domestically. But I would also say that just as Russia didn't quite understand that Russia in 2022 wasn't the Russia that existed in 2014, and so was less attractive for Ukrainians to think of themselves as part of, even in the East. Ukraine today is also different than it was in 2014.
Yeah, very much so, yes.
And this idea that everybody in a Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, an eastern part, will naturally kind of feel themselves liberated, I think has already been proven to be, fallacious, and will be, I think, proven as time goes by to hold very little truth. People are probably very tired of war.
They must be already. It's
and the sort of repression that we're seeing in those liberated territories, whether that's deportation of people back to Russia proper, or the imposition of which kind of telecoms provider you can use, which is the latest move, suggests an insecurity about the populace and the extent to which they will do exactly what Moscow asked them to do. And if that's the case, then even this Eastern strategy might prove to be problematic.
Yes, I think the Russians have tried to obviously set their strategy, but it hasn't necessarily worked to their advantage thus far. But as you say, time will probably tell on that.
I would just say, the Ukrainians have done extraordinarily well. They've done extraordinarily well because they have great leadership, because they're fighting valiantly for the homeland that they love and believe in, and for their families and their friends. And they've done very well because they've been very well equipped. They also will face a challenge, not just in having to deal with the extraordinary toll on civilian lives and of course, the economic destruction that the bombing is resulting in, but also to switch from an agile, mobile, small unit, guerrilla insurgency effort that harasses, in particular, logistics and transport links, is very different and requires different mass and different weapons, to switching to a kind of positional war where you can then push back, the opposing force, and that's going to be a real kind of challenge for the Ukrainians.
Yes, I think as things drag on, presumably it's going to be more and more of a challenge for them as they get tired, as you say, and just.
And it's very easy, or it's certainly easier for Ukraine's allies to send, Stinger missiles and NLAWs and so on, all of which are incredibly helpful in an insurgency battle. Tanks and larger equipment, is much more problematic.
Yeah, we saw with the MiGs, that whole
even harder, even harder. And so there's a sort of question about not just whether the human toll will become too great for Ukraine, but whether the materiel will be available for them to cross over. It might be. They're taking a lot of material off the Russians.
Yes, which is interesting as well.
So I wouldn't go so far as to say that it can't be done, but simply that it is a challenge.
It's a challenge, exactly. Right. Shortly, we'll come to your question. So if you have one, please do click on through. Daniel, one question before then. President Zelensky, one of the many PR things he did this week was, of course, divide up world leaders, countries into different camps and categories.
He's a great foreign policy analyst. You might want to think about hiring him for the
I think
Henry Jackson Society.
I mean, he's a superstar, so we'd of course be delighted once he finishes the Russians first. I think he's got a job to do first, but after that, very welcome. But I think it's interesting that he sort of appeared to be signaling out that Boris Johnson is having a very good war from the perspective, at least, of Ukraine, which may have surprised some people, given views of the Prime Minister here. But he has had a good war, hasn't he? I mean, I think he's led.
Oh, he has absolutely led in a number of different ways. I mean, first of all, he has had a kind of moral clarity with which he has seen this crisis. And he has, led in conversations with global leaders in support of President Zelensky with a kind of, moral clarity and a steadfastness which I simply don't think other leaders have shown. I think so. That's one. I think the second, flowing from that, clarity of intent, has been a willingness to make available to the Ukrainians almost whatever that they want at extraordinary volume, even in opposition by the bureaucracy or in the teeth of its slow-moving machinations. I think that's been hugely important. But I think there's a third, less talked about dimension, which is I think he has proven to be a comrade in arms for President Zelensky, someone that he has relied on, speaks to regularly. Most of the conversations seem not to be briefed out, but there clearly is a regular drumbeat of conversations between Prime Minister Johnson and President Zelensky that has, I assume, been critical for President Zelensky's state of mind, sense of support, and so on. And that's not to do down what President Biden has done or anybody else, but I think it is the case that
they've connected as people.
They've connected as people. I think the clarity with which they see the threat, the British Prime Minister's willingness to call out Putin in quite stark terms, to talk about the fact that he believes Putin must fail and must be seen to fail, I think has been great succor to the Ukrainians and really appreciated in a way that few Europeans, I think, have understood.
Well, how do you contrast that with President Macron?
Well, I mean, I think you've got to go back a bit because I think President Macron has always had, in my view, a little bit of a weak spot when it came to Russia policy. A willingness to position France in a slightly different place than where I think he perceived.
Isn't that just called being French?
Well, I mean, French have been great allies of the Brits over many years in many fights.
But they do like doing their own thing.
And I think it's also a sense of the fact that for various historical and cultural reasons, they see the sort of Franco-Russian relationship as very different than I think the British have ever seen the British-Russian relationship. But nonetheless, I think he came into this crisis with a kind of worldview that was probably more amenable to better relations with Russia. I think he saw an opportunity to position himself electorally in the run-up to the presidential election, and indeed, it should be said, it's worked for him.
It's worked. Yeah.
But I also think we should give credit to President Macron that he believes firmly that continuing some kind of channel of communication with President Putin is going to be worthwhile, and believes a negotiated outcome is the best way forward. So in many ways, I think there's always a temptation to say, well, he's a friend and he's not a friend. Well, he's doing right by Ukraine, he's not. Zooming out, I think it's helpful to have somebody kind of playing one flank and somebody playing the other. I don't think it would make much of a difference if Boris Johnson were to call President Putin. But it's probably not a bad thing if somebody does. I would say that I think Western leaders on the whole have been, and I exempt Boris Johnson from this, but Western leaders as a whole have been too kind to offer their time to President Putin. The idea that the best thing the Luxembourgian Prime Minister can do with his time is to call President Putin, I think is for the birds. I think we need to call President Putin less. I think we need to let him kind of stew in his bunker. If we can maintain one or two channels, such as the French president, that's fine. But the idea that everybody needs to pile in with an idea of somehow echoing our position, and by doing so, they'll get a better sense of where we're coming from, I think is for the birds, and I think we just need to leave him alone a bit.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think hopefully we will do. But let's see who is on the lines calling in. I think we have David Spector. David, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me? Yeah,
we can hear you. Yes, David, please go right ahead.
Reuters have reported today that Gazprom have said that they're continuing to supply the EU at existing rates, their gas supplies, the same rates as prior to the invasion. In view of Ukraine's continued request that we stop buying oil and gas from Russia, why don't they quite simply blow up the pipeline? The only pipeline goes through Ukraine. And so is there any obvious reason why they don't want to turn off the taps at their end?
That's a really interesting question. Daniel, what do you think?
It's a great question, David. Thank you very much for the question. The reality is that the politics of energy supplies are incredibly complex, and so are the economics. And as you'll know, given the example that you highlight, David, the Russians make money off selling it. The Europeans get gas, but the Ukrainians get a transit fee for passing the money through. And so in a sort of strange way, even though we're all at conflict, everybody somehow benefits from this exchange. And I think you're asking the right question, and I think the Ukrainians kind of want that decision to be, in a way, taken for them, probably because those who make the most money out of transit fees may or may not be exactly aligned to the Ukrainian government's interests. But it's true to say that right now, everybody makes money off this arrangement, and therefore, bizarrely, are willing to maintain it. But I would say this isn't a new phenomenon in war. During the wars of the Yugoslav dissolution, there were plenty of examples of collaboration between the Serbs and the Croats while they were shelling each other. So we've seen this time and time again. The reality, though, is that the Europeans, absent an extraordinary event such as the use of a chemical weapon or nuclear weapon, it's hard to see that we could expedite, in Europe at least, the timetable to switch off energy. And the Dutch and the Germans have been quite clear. They're, as they would say, with the program, but at a pace that's manageable.
Yes, exactly. And I think they've got their reasons for so doing. We will now go to Saisha Sori. Saisha, are you there?
Yes. I had a question about what you think of China's role in the crisis. Are they playing up to their GP peers or of their policy of non-alignment?
Great. Okay, yeah, the China role is fascinating because we talk about Turkey being in the middle. China could have been in the middle, couldn't they? But they have sort of chosen not to.
It's a great question. Lots of dimensions to this. So there's no doubt in my mind that the Chinese, and Xi in particular, sees this as a great inconvenience. There they were seeking to deal with America, developing their designs on Taiwan, on Hong Kong, pursuing President Xi's strategy of increasing Chinese economic self-dependence, and helpfully in a partnership with President Putin, who was harrying and annoying the West and banding together with China. But not doing so, banding together with China against the West, but not doing so in a way that produced outright conflict. And so what's happened now is, President Putin is becoming less valuable as an ally. His military is becoming decimated. The West is rearming. It's finding, new strength. While at the same time, the Chinese are looking at the collapse of Russian conventional forces and are worrying that they too, who have not been in a war since the Vietnamese border war in 1978, which, by the way, they eked out a draw in and lost about 28,000 Chinese regulars. So they're looking at all this with great horror. And if you sort of project forward to what President Xi probably had in mind, if there was ever to be a confrontation over Taiwan, I think he had this idea that the Russians would help prevent the American Seventh Fleet to engage, in part by using the Russian nuclear umbrella. And all that is now at risk. And I think President Xi is really struggling, and I doubt he's going to extract himself entirely from his relationship with President Putin. I think he can't, for strategic reasons, for personal reasons. But at the same time, I think the Chinese have also understood that this is not an opportune moment for them. It's too early for them to engage in the sort of great conflict with the West.
They might have wanted to do, yeah.
That maybe they want later for their own reasons, for their own purposes, not for Russia's interests and their reasons. And we must not, lose sight of this sort of sense of Russia and China, but also other countries like Brazil, arguably not India, but a bloc seeing themselves as sort of anti-Western in how they operate internationally.
So do you think, just on that Taiwan question, does the Ukraine experience make it more or less likely, in your view, that China will press the military button there?
I think it makes it less likely in the short term, but obviously I'm now hostage to extraordinary fortune. Having said that, but my reasoning is simple. I do think that the PLA are understand, as do I should say many other militaries, that the challenge of a high-tempo conventional battle against a ready, well-supplied, dug-in enemy can be extremely difficult, however large your invading force is.
And whatever you might chuck at it.
And whatever you might chuck of it, minus a nuclear attack which would make Taiwan uninhabitable and would not seek to,
which is a strange, exactly. Would it be a strange thing to do if you're claiming to reunite the
That's
places?
right.
We are out of time, Daniel. Thank you for your sage insights tonight. Thank you also for joining us at home offices, wherever you might be on the route. We will be back again next week for another edition of The Scoop. Please join us then. Have a very good evening.